The smell of barbecue smoke and burnt marshmallows drifted through Pine Lake Campground as the sun began its descent behind the towering oak trees. It was July 4th, 2023, and the Santos family had claimed their favorite spot campsite number 17, just 50 yards from the lake's edge, where the water lapped gently against the sandy shore. Maria Santos adjusted her folding chair and smiled as she watched her 3-year-old daughter Lily chase fireflies that had begun their evening dance. "Mama, look, flying lights!" Lily squealed, her chubby hands reaching toward the blinking insects. Her dark curls bounced with each step, and her summer dress, the one with tiny American flags printed all over it, swirled around her legs as she spun in circles. Tony Santos, Maria's younger brother, sat nearby nursing a beer and scrolling through his phone. At 32, he was the successful one in the family, a software engineer who just landed a promotion at a tech startup in Detroit. His wife Carmen was back home with their newborn, giving him a rare chance to spend quality time with his sister's family. He adored Lily, who called him Uncle Funny, because he always made silly faces that sent her into fits of giggles. "She's getting tired," Maria observed, noticing Lily's movements becoming less coordinated. "Maybe we should start winding down before the fireworks begin." Her husband Carlos emerged from their tent, carrying a box of sparklers he'd bought at the roadside. "Stand, not yet, mi amor? She's been looking forward to these all week." He knelt down to Lily's level. "Ready for some magic, princessa?" Lily clapped her hands excitedly. "Magic! Magic!" She had learned the word just last month and used it to describe everything that amazed her butterflies. Soap bubbles, and especially anything that sparkled or glowed. Tony glanced up from his phone as his work ringtone chimed. The display showed his boss's number strange for a holiday evening. He hesitated, watching Lily as Carlos carefully lit the first sparkler, creating a shower of golden sparks that made her gasp with delight. "Go ahead and take it," Maria said, noticing his conflicted expression. "We've got her." But Carlos was already walking toward the lake, following Lily as she waved her sparkler in wild patterns, leaving trails of light in the dusky air. Other campers had begun gathering on the beach for the fireworks display that would begin once full darkness fell. Music drifted from various campsites, country music mixing with classic rock and someone's playlist of patriotic songs. Tony's phone rang again, more insistently this time. His boss rarely called, and never on holidays, unless something was seriously wrong. The startup was in the middle of securing a major funding round, and Tony was the lead developer on their flagship product. "Watch Lily for just a minute?" Carlos called over his shoulder. "I need to grab the camera before it gets too dark for photos." "Of course," Tony replied, pocketing his phone as it stopped ringing. He moved closer to where Lily was now sitting, in the sand, carefully holding her sparkler away from her body, just as Carlos had taught her. "That's my smart girl," he murmured. The phone rang a third time. Tony glanced toward the tent where Carlos was rummaging for the camera, then at Maria, who was chatting with neighbors at the next campsite. Lily seemed completely absorbed in watching the sparkler burn down to its wire handle. "Uncle Funny, it's getting small," she announced, holding up the nearly spent sparkler. "Let me get you a new one, sweetheart." Tony reached for the box of sparklers, but his phone began ringing again. The insistent buzzing felt like an emergency. What if there was a security breach? What if the investors had pulled out? His entire career could be on the line. "Just give me 1 second, Lily," he said, answering the call while simultaneously reaching for a fresh sparkler. "Hello, Dave. What's going on?" "Tony, thank God you answered." His boss's voice was strained with panic. "We've got a major situation. Someone hacked into our development server, and they're trying to access the client database. I need you to log in remotely and help us figure out what happened." Tony felt his stomach drop. The client database contained sensitive information for hundreds of companies. A breach could destroy them before they even launched. How bad is it? He asked, already moving toward his laptop bag in the tent. Bad enough that we might lose everything if we don't contain this tonight. Can you help us? Tony looked at Lily, who had dropped her burned-out sparkler and was now collecting small stones from the beach. She seemed perfectly content, and Carlos would be back any moment. I'll need maybe 10 minutes to assess the damage, he said. The conversation became technical quickly, filled with server names and security protocols. Tony found himself walking toward the picnic table where he'd left his laptop, his attention completely absorbed by the crisis unfolding at work. He could hear Lily singing to herself, a made-up song about pretty rocks and flying lights, but his mind was racing through possible solutions to the security breach. Okay, I'm logging in now, he said, opening his laptop and connecting to the campground's spotty Wi-Fi. Talk me through what you're seeing on your end. The first fireworks began exploding overhead, brilliant bursts of red, white, and blue that painted the lake in shimmering colors. Cheers erupted from the gathered crowd on the beach. Tony glanced up briefly, seeing the celebration in his peripheral vision, but the crisis at work demanded his full attention. Uncle Funny, look. Big magic. Lily's voice called out, filled with wonder. I see it, sweetie, he replied absently, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he accessed the compromised server. Just play right there, where I can see you. But he wasn't really seeing her anymore. His world had narrowed to the glowing screen, and the urgent voice in his ear, guiding him through layers of code and security logs. The sparklers lay forgotten in their box, and somewhere in the growing darkness, between the scattered campsites and the lake's edge, a 3-year-old girl began to wander toward what looked like the most beautiful magic of all fireflies, dancing in the deep woods beyond the campground's safe boundaries. 20 minutes later, when Carlos returned with the camera and asked where Lily was, Tony looked up from his laptop with the confused expression of someone awakening from a trance. His phone was still pressed to his ear, the security crisis finally contained, but as his eyes swept the empty beach and vacant campsite, a different kind of panic began to rise in his chest. Lily! Maria's scream shattered the night air, louder than any firework. Lily, where are you? And that was the moment. Tony Santos realized that in trying to save his career, he might have lost something infinitely more precious. The search had been going for 17 hours and 53 minutes when K-9 officer Jake Morrison felt his hope beginning to crack. He'd been walking these woods since 3 a.m., following his German Shepherd Rex through terrain it would challenge experienced hikers, let alone a 3-year-old girl. The July sun was merciless, beating down through the forest canopy and turning his uniform into a sweat-soaked second skin. Rex had been working tirelessly, his black nose pressed to the ground as he followed scent trails that led nowhere, rabbit paths, deer tracks, the lingering odor of other searchers who had passed through hours earlier. Morrison had worked dozens of missing person cases in his 12 years with the Michigan State Police, but searching for children always felt different. The stakes were higher, the time more precious, and the families more desperate. Behind them, a massive search operation continued its methodical grid pattern. Over 200 volunteers had joined the effort: local police, fire departments, National Guard units, and civilian volunteers who'd driven from as far as Grand Rapids when they heard about the missing toddler. Helicopters circled overhead. In coordinated sweeps, their thermal imaging cameras scanning for any sign of heat signature in the dense underbrush. Morrison's radio crackled with constant updates. Sector 7 clear. Nothing in Sector 12. False alarm on the thermal reading, just a deer. Each negative report felt like another door closing, another possibility eliminated. Statistics ran through his mind unbidden. After 24 hours. The survival rate for lost children dropped dramatically, especially in wilderness conditions. "Come on, Rex," he murmured to his partner, scratching behind the dog's ears. "Where is she?" "Boy?" Rex had been acting strangely for the past hour, his tail held higher than usual, his movements more purposeful. Morrison had learned to trust the dog's instincts completely. Rex had found 11 missing persons in his career, including a hunter who'd been trapped under a fallen tree for 3 days. If anyone could find Lily Santos, it was Rex. The terrain they were covering now was particularly treacherous, a series of ravines and rocky outcroppings that would be nearly impossible for a small child to navigate in daylight, let alone in the dark. Morrison tried not to think about what they might find. Hypothermia was a real concern. The temperature had dropped to 48 degrees during the night, and Lily had been wearing only a thin summer dress when she disappeared. Suddenly, Rex stopped dead in his tracks. His ears shot forward, and a low whine escaped his throat. Not distress, but excitement. Morrison felt his heart rate spike. This was different from Rex's usual tracking behavior. "What is it, boy?" "What? Do you smell?" Rex bounded forward with renewed energy, pulling Morrison down a steep embankment toward a ravine that had been partially searched earlier by a different team. But Rex was heading toward a section thick with fallen logs and dense undergrowth, exactly the kind of place a frightened child might try to hide. Morrison's radio crackled as he followed Rex deeper into the ravine. "Unit 7, what's your status?" "Following up on something," Morrison replied, trying to keep the hope out of his voice. He'd learned not to raise expectations until he was certain. Too many families had been crushed by false alarms. Rex was moving with purpose now, weaving between fallen trees with the confidence of a dog who had found his target. Morrison could hear his own breathing, harsh and rapid, as adrenaline flooded his system. "Please let her be alive," he thought. "Please let us be in time." The dog stopped at a massive oak tree that had fallen during a storm earlier in the spring. Its trunk was easily 4 feet in diameter, creating a natural shelter where it had come to rest against a rocky outcropping. Rex circled the area once, and sat and barked his trained signal for found. Morrison dropped to his knees and peered into the dark space beneath the log. At first, he saw nothing but shadows and dead leaves. Then his eyes adjusted, and he saw her. Lily Santos was curled into the smallest possible ball, pressed against the far end of the natural shelter. Her summer dress was torn and stained with dirt and leaves. Her dark hair was matted with debris. Her skin had a bluish tinge that made Morrison's heart clench with fear. She wasn't moving. "Lily?" he called softly, not wanting to startle her. If she was conscious. "Lily, sweetheart, can you hear me?" No response. Morrison squeezed himself into the narrow space, his radio crackling with static as branches caught on his equipment. "Base, this is Unit 7, he said, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "I need paramedics to my location immediately." "We found her." As Morrison crawled closer, he could see the shallow rise and fall of Lily's chest. She was alive, but her breathing was rapid and shallow, signs of severe hypothermia. Her lips were pale blue, and when he gently touched her forehead, her skin felt ice-cold despite the day's heat. "Hey there, princess," he whispered, using the gentlest tone he could manage. "I'm Jake, and this is Rex. We're here to take you home to your mama and daddy." At the sound of his voice, Lily's eyelids fluttered. She was conscious, but clearly disoriented and weak. When she saw Morrison's uniform and Rex's furry face peering into the shelter, her eyes widened with what looked like terror. "It's okay, sweetheart. You're safe now. Rex is a good dog. He's the one who found you. Can you tell me if anything hurts?" Lily tried to speak, but only a tiny whimper escaped her lips. She pressed herself further back against the log, clearly frightened of these strangers despite their gentle approach. Morrison could hear voices in the distance, the paramedic team crashing through the underbrush toward their location. "Base, we're going to need a warming blanket and possibly a helicopter." "Evacuation," he radioed. "The child is conscious, but showing severe signs of hypothermia." Within minutes, the peaceful ravine was transformed into an organized chaos of rescue activity. Paramedic Sarah Chun took charge of Lily's medical care, carefully extracting the child from her makeshift shelter, while Morrison held Rex back to give them room to work. "Body temperature is dangerously low," Chun announced as she wrapped Lily in heated blankets. "We need to get her to the hospital immediately. She's been exposed to cold temperatures for nearly 18 hours. As they prepared Lily for transport, Morrison noticed something that would haunt him for weeks afterward. The little girl's eyes darted frantically between the faces of her rescuers, but she didn't make a sound. Not a word, not a cry, not even when the paramedics inserted N4 into her tiny arm. "Is she in shock?" Morrison asked Chun quietly. "Physically, yes, but there might be more to it," Chun replied, her expression grave. "Sometimes severe trauma can cause children to stop speaking entirely. We'll know more once we get her stabilized." The helicopter ride to Grand Rapids Children's Hospital was a blur of medical equipment and urgent radio communications. Morrison rode along, partly because Rex had formed an immediate bond with Lily and seemed to calm her, and partly because he couldn't bear to let the child out of his sight until she was safely reunited with her family. At the hospital, Maria Santos collapsed into Morrison's arms when she saw her daughter being wheeled into the emergency room. "Thank you," she sobbed. "Thank you for bringing her home." But even as the doctors worked to stabilize Lily's condition, and her body temperature gradually returned to normal, one thing remained unchanged. The little girl who had chattered constantly about magic and flying lights now lay silent in her hospital bed, her eyes wide and watchful, but her voice completely gone. Dr. Amanda Chun, the child psychologist called in to evaluate Lily, delivered the news that would shatter the Santos family all over again. "She's physically going to recover completely, but the psychological trauma appears to have triggered selective mutism. Simply put, Lily has retreated so far into herself to cope with the terror she experienced that she may not speak again for months, possibly years. In some cases, children never fully recover their voices. The miracle of finding Lily alive had given way to a new nightmare, the realization that the happy, talkative little girl they had lost in the woods might be gone forever, even though her body had been found. The knock on Tony Santos's door came at 6:47 a.m. on a gray October morning, exactly 3 months and 12 days after Lily had been found in the woods. Tony had been expecting it. His lawyer had warned him that charges were likely coming, but the reality of seeing 2 detectives standing on his doorstep still felt like a punch to the gut. "Anthony Santos?" Detective Lisa Martinez held up her badge, her expression professionally neutral. "We have a warrant for your arrest on charges of criminal negligence and child endangerment." Tony's hands trembled as he reached for his jacket. Behind him, his wife Carmen stood in the hallway, holding their 6-month-old son, her face a mask of barely controlled anguish. Their marriage had been disintegrating slowly since the camping trip, each day bringing new arguments about blame, responsibility, and the weight of public scrutiny. "Tony, don't say anything without the lawyer," Carmen whispered, but her voice carried none of the warmth it once had. She couldn't look at him directly anymore. Every time she did, she saw the man who had destroyed their family's reputation, and perhaps an innocent child's future. The perp walk was a media circus. News vans lined the street outside the police station, their satellite dishes reaching toward the cloudy sky like metal prayers. Reporters shouted questions as Tony was led up the courthouse steps. Do you feel responsible for Lily's condition? Have you spoken to the Santos family? What do you say to critics calling for maximum penalties? Tony kept his head down, but he could feel the weight of public judgment pressing against him like a physical force. Social media had been brutal. His photos circulated endlessly with captions like, "The uncle who failed," and "How one phone call destroyed a child." Someone had doxed his address, and protesters occasionally gathered outside his home with signs reading, "Justice for Silent Lily," and "Negligence has consequences." District Attorney Richard Vaughn had built his career on high-profile cases, and the Santos situation was exactly the kind of story that resonated with voters during election season. A successful, distracted professional who prioritized work over a child's safety. It was a narrative that played perfectly to public anxieties about modern life's competing demands. This case represents everything wrong with our society's priorities, Vaughn announced at his press conference following Tony's arraignment. A 3-year-old girl paid the price for this defendant's selfishness. She may never speak again because he couldn't be bothered to put down his phone for 20 minutes. But the most devastating blow came from within Tony's own family. Maria Santos, once his closest confidant and biggest supporter, had transformed into someone he barely recognized. The sister who used to call him every day now communicated only through lawyers. When reporters asked for her statement, her words cut deeper than any prosecutor's accusations. "My daughter was the light of our world," Maria said, standing outside Children's Hospital after one of Lily's therapy sessions. "She used to sing constantly, tell elaborate stories, ask a million questions about everything she saw. Now she sits silent for hours, and when she does interact, it's only through gestures or drawings. The doctors say she may improve with time, but they can't promise she'll ever be the same child she was before. My brother chose his career over her safety." The family schism went beyond just Maria and Tony. Their mother, Rosa Santos, found herself caught between her children, desperately trying to maintain relationships with both while watching her family tear itself apart. Carlos, Maria's husband, had initially tried to remain neutral, but as Lily's condition showed no signs of rapid improvement, his anger toward Tony hardened into something approaching hatred. He was supposed to be watching her, Carlos told a reporter from the local Spanish-language news station. That's all he had to do, watch one little girl for 20 minutes. Instead, he chose to play corporate hero while my daughter wandered into the woods alone and terrified. Tony's defense attorney, Sarah Rodriguez, faced an uphill battle from the moment she took the case. Public opinion had already convicted her client, and the victim's silent, traumatized Lily was impossible to argue against. Rodriguez knew that successful defense strategies often hinged on creating reasonable doubt about intent or finding flaws in the prosecution's timeline. But this case offered neither opportunity. "The challenge we face," Rodriguez explained to Tony during one of their strategy sessions, "is that the jury is going to see a successful man who got distracted by money while a child suffered. It doesn't matter that you're genuinely devastated by what happened. It doesn't matter that you love Lily like your own daughter. What matters is 20 minutes when you weren't paying attention." The preliminary hearings revealed the full scope of the prosecution's case. They had security footage from the campground showing Tony on his phone, completely absorbed in his laptop screen, while Lily wandered toward the tree line. They had phone records proving the exact duration of his call with his boss. Most damaging of all, they had expert testimony about selective mutism and its long-term effects on children. Dr. Amanda Chun, the child psychologist treating Lily, was scheduled to testify about the severity of Lily's condition. Selective mutism triggered by trauma can persist for years, she had written in her preliminary report. The child has essentially created a psychological barrier to protect herself from further emotional harm. Breaking through that barrier requires intensive therapy, and even then, full recovery is not guaranteed. Meanwhile, Lily's silence had become a powerful symbol in the community. Local news stations ran regular updates on her condition, always ending with the same heartbreaking image. A once vibrant little girl, now communicating only through art therapy drawings and simple gestures. Child advocacy groups had adopted her. Case as an example of how adult negligence could destroy young lives. Tony's isolation was complete. His employer had placed him on indefinite leave when the charges were filed, citing the need to distance the company from ongoing legal proceedings. Old friends stopped returning his calls. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid interacting with him. Even at the grocery store, he could feel people staring and whispering. The worst part was the guilt that consumed him from the moment he woke up until he fell into restless sleep. Tony replayed those 20 minutes thousands of times, imagining different choices, different responses to his boss's call. If he had just said no. If he had kept one eye on Lily while working. If he had asked Carlos to wait before leaving to get the camera. Carmen finally moved out on a rainy Thursday in November, taking their baby to stay with her parents in Ohio. "I can't do this anymore," she told Tony as she packed the last of her belongings. "Every time I look at you, I think about that little girl who can't speak because you couldn't say no to your boss. I need time to figure out if we can survive this." The house felt cavernous without them. Tony found himself sitting in Lily's favorite chair, the one she always claimed when she visited, declaring it the perfect size for princesses, and trying to remember the sound of her voice. The way she said, "Uncle Funny," with a slight lisp. How she sang nonsense songs that somehow always rhymed. The questions she asked about everything. Why do fireflies light up? Where does the sun go at night? Do dogs dream about bones? Now those questions would remain forever unasked, at least by Lily. And as Tony sat alone in his empty house, waiting for a trial that would determine whether his moment of inattention constituted a crime, he realized that regardless of what any jury decided, he had already been convicted by the one judge whose opinion mattered most, himself. The community's anger was palpable, but Tony's self-condemnation was absolute. He had failed the person who trusted him most, and now everyone, including the little girl he adored, would pay the price for his 20 minutes of misplaced priorities. The Kent County Courthouse had never seen anything like it. By 6 a.m. on Monday, January 22nd, news vans lined Ottawa Avenue, their satellite dishes creating a metallic forest against the gray Michigan winter sky. The trial of Anthony Santos, dubbed the Silent Child case by media outlets, had captured national attention, becoming a lightning rod for debates about parenting, technology addiction, and personal responsibility. Judge Patricia Williams surveyed the packed courtroom from her bench, her experienced eyes taking in every detail. In her 23 years on the bench, she had presided over murders, corporate fraud cases, and high-profile divorces, but nothing had prepared her for the emotional weight of this trial. The gallery was divided like a battlefield supporters. Of the Santos family on the left, child advocacy groups and protesters on the right, with a sea of reporters filling the middle sections. Lily Santos sat between her parents in the front row, her small frame dwarfed by the massive courtroom. At 3.5 years old, she should have been asking endless questions about the tall ceilings, the wooden panels, the important-looking people in dark suits. Instead, she clutched her therapy bear, a golden-colored stuffed animal given to her by Dr. Chun, and stared with wide, silent eyes at the proceedings unfolding around her Dot Maria. Santos had aged a decade in the 6 months since her daughter's disappearance. Her once vibrant black hair now showed streaks of premature gray, and dark circles under her eyes spoke of countless sleepless nights spent listening for Lily's voice, a voice that never came. She wore a simple black dress and a silver cross necklace that she touched constantly, a nervous habit that had developed during the endless therapy sessions and medical consultations. Carlos Santos sat ramrod straight beside his wife, his jaw clenched with barely controlled anger. He had taken a leave of absence from his job as a construction foreman to be present for every moment of the trial. In his mind, this wasn't just about justice. It was about making sure the world understood what Tony's negligence had cost their family. Across the courtroom, Tony Santos looked like a broken man. He had lost 30 pounds since his arrest, and his expensive suits now hung loosely on his diminished frame. His once confident demeanor had been replaced by a haunted expression that never left his face. He avoided eye contact with his sister and her family, knowing that seeing Lily's silence would only deepen his crushing guilt. District Attorney Richard Vaughn rose to deliver his opening statement, his silver hair perfectly styled, his navy suit impeccable. At 54, he had prosecuted over 100 felony cases and knew exactly how to work a jury. He had positioned this trial as a referendum on modern society's priorities, a chance to send a message about the consequences of putting technology before family. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Vaughn began, his voice carrying easily through the hushed courtroom. "This case is about 20 minutes that changed a life forever. 20 minutes when a grown man chose to prioritize a business call over the safety of a 3-year-old child. 20 minutes that transformed a happy, chattering little girl into the silent child you see before you today." He gestured toward Lily, who seemed to shrink further into her mother's side. Several jurors visibly reacted, their expressions softening with sympathy for the small victim. The prosecution will prove that Anthony Santos was entrusted with the most precious responsibility any adult can have, the care and protection of a child. We will show you that he abdicated that responsibility completely, becoming so absorbed in his corporate crisis that he lost track of little Lily Santos entirely. And we will demonstrate through expert testimony that his negligence directly caused the psychological trauma that has stolen this child's voice, perhaps permanently. Vaughn's opening was masterful, weaving together security footage, phone records, and medical testimony into a narrative of corporate selfishness destroying family bonds. He painted Tony not as a loving uncle who made a tragic mistake, but as a man whose priorities were so skewed that he could ignore a child's welfare for his own career advancement. The defense will try to convince you that this was just an accident. Vaughn continued, his tone growing more passionate. They will argue that any parent or guardian could make such a mistake. But I ask you to consider this. When you are responsible for a 3-year-old child, when you are the only barrier between that child and a dangerous world, is there any phone call, any business crisis, any career concern that should take precedence? The answer, ladies and gentlemen, is absolutely not. The prosecution's first witness was Dr. Sandra Martinez, a pediatric psychologist specializing in childhood trauma. Her testimony was devastating in its clinical precision. Selective mutism following severe psychological trauma is one of the most heartbreaking conditions I treat. Dr. Martinez explained to the rapt jury. The child essentially creates a protective barrier around themselves, retreating so far inward that verbal communication becomes impossible. In Lily's case, the terror she experienced during those 18 hours alone in the wilderness was so profound that her young mind essentially shut down her ability to speak as a defense mechanism. Defense. Attorney Sarah Rodriguez objected frequently during Dr. Martinez's testimony, but Judge Williams overruled most of her protests. The medical evidence was admissible, and its impact on the jury was undeniable. Several jurors wiped away tears as Dr. Martinez described the long-term effects of untreated childhood trauma. Will Lily ever speak again? Vaughn asked during direct examination. Dr. Martinez paused thoughtfully. With intensive therapy, there's reason for hope. But selective mutism can persist for years, sometimes decades. Some children never fully recover. The longer the condition persists, the more entrenched it becomes. Every day that passes without breakthrough is another day when normal childhood development is delayed or permanently altered. The courtroom was completely silent during this exchange. Even the reporters stopped typing, absorbed in the tragic implications of the doctor's words. Sarah Rodriguez knew she was fighting an uphill battle, but she had to try to humanize her client. During cross-examination, she focused on the medical uncertainty surrounding Lily's condition. Dr. Martinez, isn't it true that selective mutism can have multiple causes beyond trauma? Anxiety disorders, genetic predisposition, developmental delays, isn't that correct? Yes, but in this case. And isn't it also true that some children recover spontaneously, without any connection to the resolution of the triggering event? Dr. Martinez acknowledged this reluctantly. It's possible, but unlikely given the severity of Lily's initial trauma response. Rodriguez pressed further. So you cannot say with absolute medical certainty that Lily's condition is permanent, correct? No condition is absolutely certain, but thank you, doctor. It was a small victory, but Rodriguez knew she needed much more to save her client. The prosecution had painted Tony as a villain, and Lily's continued silence served as a constant reminder of the consequences of his actions. During the lunch break, Tony finally gathered the courage to approach his sister. Maria was sitting alone in a small conference room, staring at legal documents she wasn't really reading. "Maria," he said quietly, "I know you probably don't want to see me." But she looked up, and for a moment, he saw not the angry sister, who had been avoiding him for months, but the little girl who used to climb into his bed during thunderstorms, seeking protection from an older brother she trusted completely. "She drew a picture yesterday," Maria said, her voice barely above a whisper. "In therapy. Dr. Chun showed it to me. It was a family stick figures holding hands. But there were only 3 people in the picture, Tony. Just 3. She didn't include you." The words hit Tony like physical blows. For months, he had clung to the hope that somehow, someday, he could repair his relationship with Lily. The idea that she had already begun erasing him from her concept of family was almost unbearable. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I'm so sorry. Maria, if I could take it back, but you can't," she replied, standing to leave. "And neither can she. Every morning, she wakes up in a world where her voice is gone, where the thing that made her most herself, her constant chatter, her endless questions, her silly songs, doesn't exist anymore. And you did that to her, Tony. You chose 20 minutes of corporate crisis over 20 minutes of keeping my baby safe." As Maria walked away, Tony realized that no matter what the jury decided, he had already lost everything that truly mattered. The trial would determine his legal fate, but his family's judgment had already been rendered. The afternoon session continued with more prosecution witnesses, the campground security guard who had reviewed the footage, the search and rescue coordinator who described the massive effort required to find Lily, and Officer Jake Morrison, whose emotional testimony about finding the silent, terrified child in the woods left half the jury in tears. By the time Judge Williams called for adjournment, the prosecution had built a case that seemed airtight. Tony Santos appeared guilty not just in the legal sense, but in the moral court of public opinion that would ultimately determine whether his family and his community could ever forgive him. As the courtroom emptied, Lily remained seated between her parents, still clutching her therapy bear, still silent in a world that desperately wanted to hear her voice again. Sarah Rodriguez knew she was defending a man the world had already convicted. As she rose to deliver her opening statement on the trial's second day, she could feel the hostility radiating from the gallery like heat from a furnace. The morning newspapers had been brutal. Uncle's phone call silences, child forever, and corporate greed versus family love dominated the headlines. But Rodriguez had built her career on impossible cases, and she wasn't about to give up on Tony Santos. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," she began, her voice steady despite the weight of public opinion pressing against her. "The prosecution wants you to believe that my client is a monster. They want you to see a selfish man who chose money over family. But I'm here to show you the truth about Anthony Santos, truth that has been buried under months of media sensationalism and public outrage." She gestured toward Tony, who sat hunched at the defense table, his shoulders bearing the weight of months of guilt and isolation. "The man you see before you is not a villain. He is a devoted uncle who has spent sleepless nights replaying 20 minutes of his life, wishing desperately that he could change what happened. He is a man who has lost everything: his career, his marriage, his family, his community, because of a human error that could happen to any one of us." Rodriguez had spent countless hours preparing for this moment, interviewing character witnesses, reviewing security footage, and consulting with child development experts who disagreed with the prosecution's certainty about Lily's condition. Her strategy was risky but necessary: humanize Tony while challenging the assumption that his moment of inattention constituted criminal negligence. Her first witness was Elena Martinez, Tony's supervisor at the tech company. Elena had worked with Tony for 5 years and had never seen him prioritize work over family. Tony was always the first to leave the office for his niece's birthday parties or school events, Elena testified. He talked about Lily constantly, showed us pictures, shared funny stories about things she said. When she was born, he took a week of vacation just to help his sister adjust to being a new mother. This idea that he didn't care about her is completely contrary to everything I observed. Under Rodriguez's careful questioning, Elena explained the nature of the emergency that had required Tony's attention that evening. "We had discovered a potential security breach in our system that could have compromised data for over 50,000 clients," she said. "If we hadn't addressed it immediately, we could have faced lawsuits, regulatory fines, and the complete destruction of our company." Tony didn't want to take the call, but I insisted. I told him it was a genuine emergency. That couldn't wait. District Attorney Vaughn was ready with his cross-examination. "Ms. Martinez, isn't it true that no actual data was compromised that evening?" "Well, yes, and isn't it true that the emergency could have been handled by other staff members if Mr. Santos had simply said he was unavailable?" Elena hesitated. "In theory, yes, but Tony was our lead developer on that project. He was the most qualified to. So this wasn't actually a life or death emergency, was it? It was a business problem that could have been solved by someone else if Mr. Santos had simply prioritized his family responsibility over his career advancement." The exchange highlighted Rodriguez's central challenge. Every defense she mounted could be turned back into evidence of Tony's misplaced priorities. But she pressed forward, calling a succession of character witnesses who painted a picture of Tony as a loving, responsible family member. Dr. Michael Chun, a child psychologist unrelated to Lily's treating physician, provided crucial testimony about the unpredictability of selective mutism. Selective mutism is one of the most complex conditions in child psychology, Dr. Chun explained. While trauma can certainly trigger it, the condition often has multiple contributing factors: genetic predisposition, anxiety disorders, sensory processing issues, and sometimes no identifiable cause at all. I've seen children develop selective mutism after seemingly minor incidents, and I've seen other children who experience severe trauma but never develop speech difficulties. Rodriguez seized on this testimony. "Doctor, in your professional opinion, can we definitively say that Lily Santos's selective mutism was caused solely by her experience in the woods?" "No, we cannot. The timing suggests a correlation, but correlation is not causation. Children can develop selective mutism for reasons that have nothing to do with specific traumatic events. Some children are simply more vulnerable to anxiety-related speech disorders. The prosecution objected furiously, but Judge Williams allowed the testimony to stand. It was the first crack in the prosecution's narrative of direct causation. Rodriguez's most powerful witness was Carmen Santos, Tony's estranged wife. Carmen had initially refused to testify, but Rodriguez had convinced her that her testimony might be the only thing that could save Tony from prison. Carmen took the stand with visible reluctance, her hands shaking as she was sworn in. The courtroom was completely silent as Rodriguez began her questioning. Carmen, you were married to Tony Santos for 6 years. During that time, how would you describe his relationship with his niece, Lily? Carmen's voice was barely audible. He adored her. When Lily was born, Tony cried harder than anyone else in the hospital. He bought her first Christmas present before she was even a month old. He double quote. She paused, wiping her eyes. He used to say that being Lily's uncle was the best job he'd ever had. Can you describe some specific examples of Tony's devotion to Lily? When Lily was learning to walk, Tony would spend entire weekends at Maria's house, following her around with his arms out to catch her if she fell. When she got sick with pneumonia last year, he took time off work to help Maria with night feedings and doctor appointments. He taught her to say Uncle Funny before she could even say Mama properly. Rodriguez could see several jurors softening as Carmen spoke. This was the Tony Santos the public had never heard about, not the distracted corporate executive, but the doting uncle who had made Lily the center of his world. Carmen, you filed for divorce after Tony was arrested. Can you tell the jury why? Carmen broke down completely. Because I couldn't handle the guilt, she sobbed. Not his guilt, my own. I was the one who encouraged Tony to take that job. I was the one who said we needed the money for our son's future. I was the one who told him to work harder, to prove himself, to never let opportunities slip by. When he got that phone call, he was just doing what I had been telling him to do for months. Be responsible, be successful, be the provider our family needed. The courtroom erupted. Vaughn objected, claiming the testimony was irrelevant, but the damage was done. Carmen's breakdown had revealed the complex web of pressures and expectations that had contributed to Tony's decision to take that fateful phone call. During cross-examination, Vaughn tried to minimize Carmen's testimony. Mrs. Santos, regardless of the pressures your husband may have felt, he was still the adult responsible for watching Lily that evening, correct? Yes, Carmen whispered. And he made a choice to prioritize his career over her safety, didn't he? He made a mistake, Carmen replied, her voice stronger now. A terrible, heartbreaking mistake that he will regret for the rest of his life. But it was a mistake, not a crime. And it was a mistake that I helped create by making him feel like our family's financial security depended on his perfect performance. At work, Rodriguez's final witness was the most unexpected. Officer Jake Morrison, the canine handler who had found Lily. The prosecution had called Morrison during their case, but Rodriguez had subpoenaed him back for the defense. Officer Morrison, you've been involved in dozens of missing child cases. In your experience, how common is it for children to wander away from supervised adults? Morrison considered the question carefully. More common than people think. Children are naturally curious and impulsive. I've found kids who wandered away from parents at shopping malls, amusement parks, family reunions. It happens to good parents, bad parents, and everything in between. Kids don't understand danger the way adults do. In your professional opinion, was this incident the result of criminal negligence, or was it a tragic accident? Vaughn objected, but Morrison answered anyway. In my experience, accidents happen, even to the most careful, loving families. I've seen too many parents destroy themselves with guilt over split-second decisions or momentary distractions. This looked like an accident to me, A horrible accident with devastating consequences, but an accident nonetheless. As Rodriguez concluded her defense case, the courtroom atmosphere had shifted slightly. Tony was still facing serious charges, and Lily was still sitting silently in the front row, but the defense had successfully complicated the narrative. Tony Santos was no longer simply a villain. He was a complex human being who had made a terrible mistake under circumstances that many people could understand, if not forgive. But as Rodriguez looked at the jury, she knew that understanding and legal acquittal were two very different things. The question now was whether 12 strangers could separate their emotions from the law, and whether they could find reasonable doubt in a case where a child's silence spoke louder than any words. The trial was entering its third week when Dr. Amanda Chun made the request that would change everything. She had been sitting in the courtroom gallery, observing Lily's behavior during the proceedings as part of her ongoing psychological evaluation. What she saw concerned her deeply and sparked an idea that was either brilliant or completely insane. "Your Honor, I request a brief sidebar," Dr. Chun announced during the morning recess, rising from her seat in the gallery. Judge Patricia Williams looked surprised. While Dr. Chun had been scheduled to testify later in the week, she wasn't expected to participate in the proceedings at this point. "Dr. Chun, you're not currently on the witness list for today." "I understand, Your Honor, but I have an urgent motion to make regarding the welfare of the child victim. It's a matter that could significantly impact these proceedings." Williams glanced at both attorneys, who looked equally puzzled, then nodded. "Approach the bench, all of you." At the sidebar, Dr. Chun's proposal left everyone stunned. "Your Honor, I'm requesting permission to bring my therapy dog, Captain, into the courtroom. Lily has been showing signs of increased distress during these proceedings, and based on my work with her over the past 6 months, I believe Captain's presence could help stabilize her emotional state and potentially facilitate communication." District Attorney Vaughn immediately objected. "Your Honor, this is highly irregular. We're not running a petting zoo here. This appears to be a desperate attempt by the defense to create sympathy for their client through emotional manipulation." Defense attorney Sarah Rodriguez, despite being surprised by the request, recognized an opportunity. "Your Honor, if Dr. Chun believes this could help Lily, shouldn't we prioritize the child's welfare? My client has always maintained that Lily's well-being is his primary concern." Judge Williams had presided over thousands of cases, but nothing in her legal training had prepared her for this moment. "Dr. Chun, can you provide more specific justification for this unusual request?" Dr. Chun pulled out a thick file folder. "Your Honor, I've been documenting Lily's interactions with Captain during our therapy sessions. The results have been remarkable. While she remains completely nonverbal with humans, she has begun making sounds, not words, but vocalizations when interacting with Captain. She hums, she makes clicking noises. She even laughed once when he performed a trick. She opened the folder to reveal dozens of photographs and video stills, showing Lily engaged with the golden retriever. In some images, the little girl appeared more animated than anyone had seen her since her rescue. Captain is a certified therapy animal with specialized training in trauma response," Dr. Chun continued. "He's worked with dozens of children who have experienced severe psychological trauma. His presence has never once caused disruption or distraction in any therapeutic setting." Vaughn was growing increasingly agitated. "Your Honor, this is a courtroom, not a therapy session." The prosecution objects in the strongest possible terms. "This appears to be an attempt to create a circus atmosphere that will distract the jury from the serious criminal charges at hand." But Judge Williams was studying the photographs with growing interest. In her 23 years on the bench, she had seen countless child victims, and she had never encountered a case quite like Lily's. A complete silence was unnerving even to her, and if there was any chance, that the child might benefit from this intervention, didn't she have a responsibility to consider it? Mr. Vaughn, while I understand your concerns about courtroom decorum, I must remind you that this court's primary obligation is to the welfare of the child victim. Dr. Chun, what specific outcomes are you hoping to achieve? Your Honor, I'm not expecting miracles. But Lily's stress levels during these proceedings have been extremely elevated. Her sleep patterns have deteriorated, she's barely eating, and she's showing signs of regression in her therapy progress. Captain's presence might help her feel secure enough to remain in the courtroom without further traumatization. Rodriguez sensed an opening. Your Honor, the defense would also note that Lily's current state of distress may be impacting the jury's ability to fairly evaluate the evidence. If Dr. Chun's intervention could help Lily feel more comfortable, it might actually serve the interests of justice by allowing the proceedings to continue without the emotional weight of a visibly traumatized child. This was a strategic gamble by Rodriguez. While she genuinely cared about Lily's welfare, she also knew that anything that humanized the situation and moved away from the stark narrative of criminal negligence might help her client. Judge Williams called for a 30-minute recess to research legal precedents and consult with her clerk. During the break, word of Dr. Chun's request leaked to the media, causing a sensation outside the courthouse. Reporters debated whether allowing a therapy dog in criminal proceedings would set a dangerous precedent or represent a compassionate innovation in trauma-informed justice. Inside the courthouse, Maria Santos approached Dr. Chun with tears in her eyes. Do you really think Captain could help her? She's been having nightmares again since the trial started. She wakes up screaming, but she still won't tell me what's wrong. She can't tell me what's wrong. I can't promise anything, Dr. Chun replied gently. But Lily has formed a genuine bond with Captain. In our sessions, he seems to be the only person she trusts completely. Dogs don't judge. They don't ask questions. They don't want anything except to be present. For a child who has retreated so far into herself, that unconditional acceptance can be incredibly powerful. Carlos Santos remained skeptical. What if it doesn't work? What if it makes things worse? I don't want my daughter to be part of some experiment. Carlos, I understand your concerns, Dr. Chun said, but traditional therapy approaches aren't working quickly enough. Lily is stuck, psychologically speaking. She needs something to help her feel safe enough to begin healing. Captain represents safety and comfort to her. He doesn't represent the adult world that failed to protect her. When court reconvened, Judge Williams had made her decision, but not without establishing strict parameters. After reviewing relevant case law and consulting with child welfare experts, I am going to allow Dr. Chun's request with the following conditions. First, the therapy dog must be under Dr. Chun's direct control at all times. Second, the animal's presence must not disrupt courtroom proceedings in any way. Third, if either attorney believes the animal's presence is prejudicing their case, they may renew their objection, and I will reconsider. Fourth, this decision is being made solely in the interests of the child, victim's welfare, and should not be interpreted as setting any broader legal precedent. The courtroom erupted in murmurs of surprise and excitement. This was unprecedented in Michigan legal history, and possibly in the entire country. Reporters frantically typed on their phones, knowing this decision would make national headlines. Within hours, Vaughn made one final objection for the record. Your Honor, the prosecution maintains that this decision is highly irregular and potentially prejudicial to our case. We are concerned that the jury will be swayed by emotional responses rather than focusing on the legal evidence. Your objection is noted, Mr. Vaughn. However, I believe this court has an obligation to minimize additional trauma to a child victim, even in the context of criminal proceedings. Dr. Chun, when can you have the therapy dog available? Captain is actually here, Your Honor. I brought him today in case you approved the request. He's waiting in my car with my assistant. Judge Williams looked around the courtroom, taking in the faces of the jurors, the attorneys, the family members, and the packed gallery. She was about to make legal history, and she knew it. But as she looked at Lily Santos, small, silent, and fragile in the front row, she knew she was making the right decision. Very well. We'll recess for 15 minutes to allow Dr. Chun to bring Captain into the courtroom and get him settled. When we reconvene, I want absolute silence and respect for this therapeutic intervention. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, you are about to witness something that has never before occurred in a Michigan courtroom. I trust you will conduct yourselves with appropriate dignity. As the court recessed, Dr. Chun hurried to retrieve Captain, knowing that the next few minutes could either vindicate her professional judgment or result in a disaster that would haunt her career forever. Either way, Lily Santos was about to encounter the first familiar, comforting presence she had experienced since this legal nightmare began. The stakes had never been higher, and everyone in the courtroom understood that they were about to witness something that would change not just this trial, but potentially the future of how the legal system handles traumatized child victims. The courtroom fell into an expectant hush as Dr. Amanda Chun opened the heavy wooden doors. Captain, a magnificent golden retriever with intelligent amber eyes and a lustrous coat, padded quietly beside her on a short leather leash. He wore his official therapy vest royal blue with white lettering that read, Therapy DOG, do not pet, and moved with the calm confidence of an animal who had spent years helping humans in their darkest moments. Judge Patricia Williams watched from her bench as Dr. Chun guided Captain down the center aisle. The dog's behavior was impeccable. His ears were alert but relaxed, his tail held at a neutral position, his gait steady and purposeful. Captain had been through this routine hundreds of times in hospitals, counseling centers, and schools, but never in a courtroom filled with 200 people holding their collective breath. The silence was so complete that the soft click of Captain's nails on the marble floor seemed amplified. Veteran court reporter Margaret Hayes, who had transcribed testimony for over 30 years, found herself unable to type, mesmerized by the unprecedented scene unfolding before her. Even the most hardened journalists in the gallery had stopped taking notes, sensing they were witnessing a moment that would define their careers. Lily Santos had been sitting between her parents in her usual position, pressed against her mother's side, her small hands clutching her therapy bear, her dark eyes staring blankly ahead. But the moment Captain appeared in the doorway, something changed. Her head turned with the first sign of genuine interest anyone had seen from her in weeks. Captain sensed Lily's attention immediately. His years of training had taught him to recognize the energy patterns of traumatized children, and something about this small, silent girl called to him in ways that transcended his professional conditioning. Without any signal from Dr. Chun, he paused in his measured walk and looked directly at Lily, his intelligent eyes conveying the patient, non-judgmental presence that made him so effective in his work. Maria Santos felt her daughter's body tense, not with fear, but with recognition. "Lily?" she whispered, so quietly that only Carlos could hear. "Do you remember Captain from your therapy sessions?" For the first time in months, Lily made a sound, not a word, but a soft intake of breath that suggested recognition, possibly even happiness. She began to slide down from her mother's lap, her movements careful but deliberate, as if drawn by an invisible thread connecting her to the golden dog. Dr. Chun had positioned herself and Captain about 10 feet from the family section, close enough for interaction, but respectful of the courtroom's formal boundaries. She watched Lily's movements with professional fascination and personal hope. In their private therapy sessions, Lily's interactions with Captain had been their only consistent breakthrough. Now, in this sterile, intimidating environment filled with strangers and tension, Would that magical connection still exist? Captain remained perfectly still as Lily approached, his training keeping him motionless until given permission to interact. But his eyes never left the child, and his tail began a slow, gentle wag that conveyed welcome without excitement. He seemed to understand that this moment required infinite patience and absolute calm. District Attorney Richard Vaughn watched the scene unfold with growing discomfort. Every instinct told him that this theatrical display was designed to manipulate the jury's emotions, but he couldn't deny the genuine nature of Lily's response. The child who had sat like a statue throughout weeks of testimony was suddenly showing signs of life, and objecting to that would make him appear heartless. Defense attorney Sarah Rodriguez felt her own eyes filling with tears as she watched her client's niece slowly make her way toward Captain. Tony Santos was leaning forward. In his chair, his face a mixture of hope and agonizing guilt. This was the first time he had seen Lily show interest in anything since the camping trip, and the sight was both heartening and heartbreaking. Lily reached Captain and stopped just inches from his golden fur. The courtroom held its breath as she extended one small hand toward the dog's head. Captain remained statue still, allowing the child to make the first contact on her own terms. When her fingers finally touched his fur, a visible shudder of relief seemed to pass through her tiny frame. For several minutes, the only sounds in the courtroom were the soft whispers of Lily's fingers moving through Captain's coat and the barely audible settling of 200 people trying not to disrupt the fragile moment unfolding before them. Several jurors were openly crying, moved by the first sign of connection they had witnessed from the traumatized child. Then Lily did something that made everyone in the courtroom gasp. She sank to her knees beside Captain and wrapped her arms around his neck, burying her face in his fur. The dog remained perfectly still, but his tail wagged faster, and he made a soft sound, not quite a whine, but a gentle vocalization that seemed designed to comfort. Judge Williams found herself wiping tears from her eyes as she watched the interaction. In over 2 decades on the bench, she had never seen anything quite like this. The child who had been silent for 8 months was finding her voice, not in words, but in the physical language of trust and connection. Dr. Chun knelt down beside Lily and Captain, her voice barely above a whisper. "Lily, this is Captain. Do you remember him from our talks? He's been missing you." Lily looked up at Dr. Chun and nodded, the first direct communication she had made with an adult in the courtroom. Then she turned back to Captain and did something that sent shockwaves through the entire room. She began to hum. It was so soft at first that only those in the front rows could hear it, a wordless melody that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her chest. But in the absolute silence of the courtroom, the sound carried like a prayer. Lily was humming a lullaby that Maria had sung to her as a baby, a Spanish song about little birds flying home to their nests. Maria Santos collapsed into sobs, her hand covering her mouth to muffle the sound. Carlos put his arm around his wife, his own eyes streaming with tears. For 8 months, they had listened to silence from their daughter. Now, finally, they were hearing her voice again, not in words, but in music. As Lily continued humming, Captain began to respond in ways that amazed even Dr. Chun. He gently licked the child's hand, then carefully positioned himself so that she could lean against his side. The dog seemed to understand that his role was to be a living, breathing security blanket for a child who had retreated so far into herself that human contact had become impossible. But then came the moment that would be replayed on every news station in America within hours. Lily stopped humming and looked directly into Captain's amber eyes. In a voice so soft it was barely audible, but clear enough for everyone in the front section to hear, she spoke her first words in 8 months. "Good boy." The courtroom erupted. Some spectators burst into applause before catching themselves and falling silent. Others wept openly. Several jurors were visibly shaken, wiping their eyes and struggling to compose themselves. Tony Santos buried his face in his hands, overwhelmed by a mixture of joy and guilt. His niece had finally spoken, but would she ever speak to him again? Would she ever forgive him for the 20 minutes that had stolen so much from her young life? Judge Williams called for order, but her own voice was thick with emotion. Ladies and gentlemen, please maintain courtroom decorum. Dr. Chun, how long do you need with the child? Just a few more minutes, Your Honor. This is exactly the kind of breakthrough we've been hoping for. As Lily continued to whisper to Captain Soft words of affection and comfort that only the dog could fully understand, everyone in the courtroom realized they had witnessed something extraordinary. A child who had been lost in silence had found her voice again, not through medical intervention or psychological techniques, but through the simple, unconditional love of a therapy dog who asked nothing of her except to be herself. The trial would continue, and Tony Santos would still face judgment for his actions. But in this moment, hope had returned to the Santos family for the first time in 8 months. Lily's voice was coming back, one whispered word at a time, and Captain was showing her the way home from the silent world where she had been hiding. The golden retriever, trained to help but never to heal miracles, had somehow managed to unlock the door that trauma had closed in a little girl's heart. And in doing so, he had given everyone in the courtroom, including the man who had failed to protect her, a glimpse of the possibility of redemption and recovery. The courtroom had been forever changed by Lily's whispered words. As Judge Patricia Williams called for a 15-minute recess to allow everyone to compose themselves, the atmosphere in the room had shifted from one of legal combat to something approaching reverence. The miracle they had all witnessed, a traumatized child finding her voice through the patient love of a therapy dog, had transformed the nature of the proceedings in ways that no legal proceeding could have prepared them for. District Attorney Richard Vaughn sat at the prosecution table, staring at his carefully prepared closing arguments. Every word he had written now seemed hollow and vindictive in the face of what he had just witnessed. How could he continue to argue for maximum penalties against Tony Santos when the child at the center of the case had just demonstrated that healing was not only possible, but actively occurring? "We need to talk," Vaughn said quietly to his assistant prosecutor, Janet Morrison. "That changes everything." Meanwhile, defense attorney Sarah Rodriguez was experiencing her own crisis of conscience. She had been prepared to argue that Tony's actions didn't constitute criminal negligence, but watching Lily's breakthrough had made her realize that the legal victory she had been pursuing might be less important than the family healing that was now within reach. Tony Santos remained at the defense table, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. For 8 months, he had lived with the crushing weight of knowing that his moment of inattention had stolen his niece's voice. Now, seeing her speak again, even just 2 simple words to a therapy dog, felt like a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. But the guilt remained overwhelming. Would she ever speak to him again? Could she ever forgive him for the 20 minutes that had changed everything? Dr. Amanda Chun knelt beside Lily and Captain, documenting the breakthrough with the clinical precision that her profession demanded, while marveling at the emotional magnitude of what was occurring. In 15 years of working with traumatized children, she had never seen anything quite like this. Lily was now stroking Captain's fur with both hands, whispering a steady stream of soft words that only the dog could hear. "What is she saying?" Maria Santos asked, kneeling beside her daughter for the first time in months without causing Lily to withdraw. "She's telling him about the woods," Dr. Chun said softly, interpreting Lily's whispered words. "She's telling him about being scared and cold, about hearing voices calling her name, about hiding under the log. She's finally processing the trauma verbally, which is exactly what we've been hoping for." Carlos Santos stood behind his wife and daughter, tears streaming down his face as he watched his little girl slowly returning to them. The man who had spent 8 months consumed with rage toward his brother-in-law was beginning to understand that healing required forgiveness, not just justice. Judge Williams returned to her bench after consulting with court psychiatrists and legal experts about how to proceed. Never in her 23 years as a judge had she encountered a situation where the victim's condition changed so dramatically during the trial itself. "Ladies and gentlemen," she announced to the reconvened court, "what we have witnessed today is unprecedented in legal history. Before we proceed with closing arguments, I'm going to allow both counsel to request a brief recess to reconsider their positions in light of recent developments." Vaughn rose immediately. "Your Honor, the prosecution requests a brief recess to consult with the victim's family about how they wish to proceed." Rodriguez nodded. "The defense concurs with that request, Your Honor." During the recess, something remarkable occurred in the courthouse hallway. Maria Santos, still shaken by watching her daughter speak for the first time in 8 months, approached her brother for the first time since his arrest. "Tony," she said quietly, her voice thick with emotion, "I need to tell you something." Tony looked up, afraid to hope for forgiveness, but desperate to hear his sister's words. "Lily spoke today," Maria continued. "But before she said good boy to Captain, do you know what she whispered to him first? She said, 'Uncle Funny's sad.' She hasn't forgotten you, Tony. Even after everything that happened, she hasn't forgotten that you're family." The words hit Tony like a physical blow. After months of believing that he had lost Lily forever, learning that she still thought of him as Uncle Funny, still cared about his emotional state, opened a floodgate of hope and guilt that left him speechless. "I'm not ready to forgive you completely," Maria said, her honesty cutting but not cruel. "But I'm ready to try. Lily's healing has to be our priority now, and Dr. Chun says that isolation from family members who love her could actually slow her recovery." Within hours, the prosecution and defense had reached a plea agreement that reflected the dramatic change in circumstances. Tony Santos pled guilty to a reduced charge of child endangerment, with a sentence of 18 months probation, 500 hours of community service with child safety organizations, and mandatory completion of a family therapy program that would include supervised visits with Lily. The plea hearing itself was unlike anything the courthouse had ever seen. Captain remained in the courtroom at Dr. Chon's side, and Lily sat with her parents, occasionally speaking single words or short phrases to the therapy dog. When Judge Williams asked Tony if he understood the terms of his plea agreement, Lily looked up for the first time during the proceedings. "Uncle Funny?" she said quietly, her voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom. Tony turned toward his niece, tears streaming down his face. "Hi, Princess," he whispered back. "I'm so sorry." Lily studied his face for a long moment, then turned to Captain. "Uncle Funny's sorry," she told the dog, as if the golden retriever were her translator for understanding the adult world that had failed to protect her. Judge Williams delivered her acceptance of the plea with words that would be quoted in legal journals for years to come. "This case has taught us that justice is not always about punishment. Sometimes it's about creating the conditions for healing and ensuring that such tragedies never occur again." The months that followed were challenging, but filled with gradual progress. Lily's therapy sessions with Captain continued, and slowly, her vocabulary expanded beyond whispers to the therapy dog. Dr. Chung documented each milestone. The first time Lily spoke directly to her mother again. The first full sentence, the first laugh, the first time she asked a question. Tony's supervised visits with Lily began 3 months after the plea hearing. The first meeting was heartbreaking. Lily hid behind Captain and wouldn't look at her uncle directly. But by the 4th visit, she was cautiously accepting small gifts from him. By the 8th visit, she called him Uncle Funny again, though. She still needed Captain's presence to feel secure. The community service portion of Tony's sentence proved transformative. Working with child safety organizations, he helped develop new protocols for family camping trips and community events. His personal experience with the devastating consequences of momentary inattention made him an effective advocate for child supervision awareness. Carmen Santos eventually returned from Ohio with their son, and the family began the slow process of rebuilding their marriage. The couple started attending the same family therapy sessions as Tony and Lily, working to understand how societal pressures and professional demands had contributed to the choices that led to the tragedy. Captain became a permanent part of Lily's healing journey, eventually transitioning from therapy sessions to becoming the family's pet. The golden retriever who had unlocked Lily's voice became her constant companion, sleeping beside her bed and accompanying her to preschool once she was ready to rejoin other children. A year after the trial, Lily Santos was speaking in full sentences, asking endless questions about the world around her, and occasionally mentioning her adventure in the woods as something that happened when I was little and scared. The selective mutism had not completely disappeared. She still became quiet in new situations, or when overwhelmed, but Dr. Chun was optimistic that with continued therapy and Captain's support, Lily would make a full recovery. The case became a landmark in trauma-informed justice, leading to new protocols for handling child victims in legal proceedings and expanded use of therapy animals in courtrooms across the country. More importantly, it demonstrated that healing was possible even after the most devastating traumas, and that sometimes the path to recovery came not through human intervention, but through the patient, unconditional love of a golden retriever, who saw not a broken child, but a little girl who simply needed to remember how to trust again. Tony Santos would carry the guilt of those 20 minutes for the rest of his life, but he also learned that redemption was possible through dedication to preventing similar tragedies and supporting his niece's continued healing. The uncle who had failed to protect Lily became one of her strongest advocates in recovery, proving that even the deepest family wounds could begin to heal when love, accountability, and hope worked together. The last line of Dr. Chun's case file, written 2 years after the trial, captured the ultimate lesson of their journey. Patient exhibited complete recovery of verbal communication skills and normal childhood development. Therapy dog Captain officially retired from active duty, but continues his family pet. Family reports strong bonds and successful completion of healing process. Case demonstrates that with proper support, love, and a very special golden retriever, even the most profound trauma can be overcome.